In the spring of 1974, Carl Dawson planted 40 acres of open-pollinated corn in Poweshiek County, Iowa, while every neighbor within 12 miles switched to Pioneer hybrid seed. The county extension agent, a man named Vernon Stout, who had driven out from the office in Montezuma to check the planting progress along County Road F38, stopped his truck when he saw Carl's planter in the field. He watched for a moment. Then he drove up the lane and asked Carl what seed he was running. Carl told him. Vernon Stout wrote something in his notebook. He was 37 years old, had a master's degree from Iowa State, and genuinely believed he was trying to help when he told Carl Dawson that open-pollinated corn was a 1954 solution to a 1974 problem. He said the yield drag alone, 8 to 12 bushels per acre behind the certified hybrids, would cost Carl roughly $400 over the course of that season. He said this with the quiet authority of a man who has the numbers and assumes the numbers are the whole story. Carl listened. Then he said, "I appreciate that, Vernon. You can't have the coffee this morning, but I'll see you in the fall." Vernon Stout got back in his truck. He wrote 4 more sentences in his notebook. And 48 mason jars in a root cellar under Carl Dawson's house waited in the dark, labeled in pencil, patient as only seeds can be patient. Poweshiek County sits in the center of Iowa, in the deep, rich heartland of the state, where the Des Moines lobe of the last glacier left behind some of the most productive soil on the surface of the earth. The ground there, Tama silty clay loam, muscatine silt loam, the black soil that runs 6 feet deep in the low draws, was the reason the first settlers filed claims so fast in the 1840s and 1850s that the county was organized before most of the houses were built. When Iowa farmers talk about good ground, they usually mean something like Poweshiek County. When the rest of the world talks about American agricultural abundance, they are usually, without knowing it, talking about places that look exactly like this: flat, black-soiled, windy, immense, and quietly extraordinary. Carl Dawson was born in 1,936 inches, a farmhouse 3 miles south of Deep River, Iowa, the second of 4 children. His father, Raymond Dawson, had farmed 200 acres through the Depression and the war years, mostly corn and oats, and a small hog operation, with a team of Percheron horses until 1947, and then an Alice Chalmers WD until Raymond's death in 1969. Raymond was a careful man. He kept records. He saved seed. He did not buy what he could grow, did not borrow what he could earn, and did not throw away what he could use. These were not principles he articulated. They were just how he farmed, the way grammar is, how you speak invisible until someone breaks it. Carl had grown up helping his mother, Clara, process the seed corn each fall. This was a 2-week operation in October, after the field corn had dried down, conducted in the kitchen and the root cellar and the back porch. Clara would select ears from the best-performing plants in the field. She had been doing this since 1938 and had a practiced eye for the characteristics she wanted: good husk cover, tight-set kernels to the tip, deep red color on the cob, straight rows. She would dry the ears on a wooden rack in the back room, then shell them by hand and sort them for uniformity. The seed went into mason jars, half pint, and quart, depending on the lot size, and was labeled in pencil. Year, field location, plant selection notes. The jars went into the root cellar, where the temperature stayed between 42 and 48 degrees year-round, which is nearly perfect for long-term seed viability. Carl took over the seed selection entirely when he was 17. By the time he started farming on his own, after Raymond died, he had been selecting from that same corn population for 11 years. He knew its characteristics, the way a musician knows a familiar piece, not just the notes, but the tendencies, the places where it surprised you, the particular stubbornness of it in a dry year, and the way it recovered after a bad early season. He did not think of it as a variety. He thought of it as his corn. because in the way that mattered most through 30 years of selection for his specific soil, his specific microclimate, his specific rainfall patterns it was. The Iowa that Carl Dawson farmed in 1974 was not the Iowa of his father. The Green Revolution had been underway for a decade. Pioneer Hybrid, which was headquartered in Johnston, Iowa, had developed a succession of hybrid corn varieties through the 1960s that yielded 15 to 25 bushels per acre, more than the open-pollinated varieties when grown with the Recommended Fertility Program. The Recommended Fertility Program involved anhydrous ammonia applied at 140 to 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which cost money, and 80 to 100 pounds of phosphate, which cost more money, and a herbicide program on top of that. And the hybrids were bred to respond to those inputs to convert fertilizer into yield with an efficiency that the older, open-pollinated varieties, selected for a lower input system, could not match. The deal being offered to Iowa farmers in 1974 was essentially this: buy our seed every year, because you cannot legally save hybrid seed and replant it with consistent results, and buy our inputs, and in return, you will yield more bushels per acre. This was a true statement. The yield numbers were real. And by 1974, virtually every commercial corn farmer in Poweshiek County had taken that deal. Carl Dawson had not. He had thought about it. He was not ignorant of the yield data. He subscribed to the Iowa State Extension publication and read every issue. He had attended the winter meeting at the Montezuma Co-op in February of 1968, where the Pioneer representative had laid out the yield trial results in careful detail, and the numbers were, in fact, impressive. Carl had sat in the third row and listened and asked 2 questions, and neither question was about yield. He had asked, what happens to the germplasm in these varieties if you discontinue them? The Pioneer representative had said that was not a concern, because Pioneer maintained extensive germplasm banks. Carl had asked, who controls access to those banks? There had been a short pause. The Pioneer representative said, Pioneer does. Carl had nodded, thanked the man, driven home, and in the spring of 1969, planted the same corn his mother had been selecting since 1938. He was not a prophet. He was not a visionary. He was a man who had grown up watching his mother handle seeds with the same careful attention she brought to everything else that kept the farm alive, and who had absorbed, without being taught it directly, the idea that the ability to grow your own seed was not a technique, it was a form of independence, and independence, in Carl Dawson's understanding of farming, was not a luxury, it was the whole point. What it cost him in the short term was real. Vernon Stout's numbers were not wrong. In 1974, Carl's open-pollinated corn yielded 89 bushels per acre. His neighbor Harlan Cruzy, farming ground of nearly identical quality 2 miles to the east, ran Pioneer 3369A at 104 bushels per acre. That was a 15-bushel gap at a corn price of $3.02 per bushel on 40 acres. Carl left roughly $1,800 on the table that year compared to what Harlan had made. Over the following decade, the gap was consistent. Some years it was 12 bushels. Some years it was 18. Once, in the wet year of 1979, it was only 7. But it was always there, and in Poweshiek County, where farmers knew each other's yields the way they knew each other's faces, it was noticed. The co-op in Deep River was a low, tan building with a scale out front and a coffee pot that ran from 6 in the morning until the last farmer left in the afternoon. The conversation there was not malicious. It was the ordinary conversation of practical men assessing practical realities. Earl Moody said Carl Dawson was farming like it was 1,950. Dennis Harrington said Carl was stubborn in the way of men who've never had to really lose anything. Harold Vickers, who ran the Cenex fuel stop on the highway, said he admired Carl's independence in principle, but that in practice, Independence that cost you $800 a year was just stubbornness with a nicer name. Vernon Stout, the extension agent, visited Carl's operation twice more in the 1970s. His reports noted the below-average yields and recommended the transition to certified hybrid seed each time. Carl filed the reports in a box in the machine shed with the tax records and other documents he was required to keep, but did not particularly need. What nobody at the co-op and nobody in Vernon Stout's reports accounted for was what Carl was doing in October. Every October, in the 2 weeks after harvest, Carl walked his cornfield in the methodical way his mother had taught him. He was selecting for the same traits she had selected for husk cover, kernel set, cob color, row alignment, but he had added his own criteria over the years. He selected heavily for standability, plants that had not lodged in the August windstorms, which came every 3 or 4 years across central Iowa, with enough force to push a poorly rooted hybrid flat to the ground. He selected for drought tolerance. In a dry July, which happened reliably every 4 to 6 years, certain plants in his field maintained their silk emergence and pollination timing, while others aborted. He marked those stalks with flagging tape in August and came back for their ears in October. He selected for early season vigor, because the wet springs that delayed planting in April and May were the rule in Poweshiek County, not the exception, and a plant that could push through cold, wet ground and establish itself quickly was worth more to him than a plant that peaked at the ideal conditions the university yield trials assumed. He was, in the language that plant breeders use, conducting recurrent mass selection on a locally adapted population. He did not use that language. He called it saving seed. But what he was building, year by year, October by October, was a corn variety that was increasingly, specifically fitted to his ground, his weather, his farming system, a living document of 35 years of Poweshiek County growing seasons, encoded in genetics that he owned, that no corporation had a claim on, and that no discontinued product line could take away from him. The jars in the root cellar accumulated. By 1980, he had seed from 12 consecutive years of selection. By 1990, 22 years. By 2000, 32. He labeled each jar with the year and a one-line note. 1,988 drought year selection, East Field. 1,993 lodging resistance, North 40. 1,996 early silk, wet spring emergence. A graduate student from Iowa State named Molly Hardin visited the farm in 1998, doing a survey of seed-saving practices in Iowa, and spent 3 hours in Carl's root cellar going through the FAR jars. She said it was the most systematically maintained open-pollinated corn selection she had encountered in the state outside of a university program. Carl thanked her and offered her a cup of coffee, which she accepted. She told her advisor about it. The advisor expressed polite interest and said that open-pollinated corn was not a commercially viable direction for modern Iowa agriculture. Molly Hardin filed her survey notes and moved on to her dissertation. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the yield gap between Carl's open-pollinated corn and his neighbor's hybrids actually narrowed somewhat, not because the hybrids got worse, but because Carl's selection program was compounding. His population, grown on his specific ground for 30 years, had been shaped by 30 years of his specific challenges, and it was performing better on that specific ground than any off-the-shelf variety could. In 2001, Carl's corn yielded 127 bushels per acre. Harlan Cruz's Pioneer Hybrid, on ground 2 miles east, yielded 141. The gap was 14 bushels, down from 15 in 1974, after 27 years of selection work. This did not make headlines. Nobody noticed. Carl noted it in his farm journal with a quiet satisfaction he did not express to anyone. The deep crisis, when it came, did not arrive on Carl Dawson's farm first. It arrived everywhere else. In 2009, the Monsanto Corporation, which had by then acquired a controlling position in the commercial seed industry in the United States, won a patent infringement case against an Indiana farmer named Vernon Hugh Bowman, who had purchased commodity soybeans from a grain elevator and replanted them, thereby growing Roundup-ready soybeans without paying the technology fee. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously against Bowman in 2013. The logic of the ruling held that a farmer who replants a patented seed is infringing the patent even if he purchased the seed legitimately, because the act of growing the seed creates new copies of the patented organism. Carl read about this in the Des Moines Register on a Thursday morning in May of 2013, drinking coffee at his kitchen table. He was 77 years old. His corn was in the ground. The root cellar held 40 years of jars. He cut the article out of the paper and pinned it to the bulletin board above the workbench in the machine shed. He did not write anything on it. He did not show it to anyone. He just pinned it up, the way you pin up something you want to keep looking at. Years earlier, in the winter of 1999, his son-in-law, a man named Dale Prochaska, who had married Carl's daughter Ruth in 1987 and farmed 340 acres of his own ground in the next township, had sat at Carl's kitchen table and made a careful, respectful argument for why Carl should transition to certified hybrid seed. Dale was not wrong. He laid out the numbers with the patience of a man who likes numbers and believes in them. The yield advantage, the input efficiency of the newer hybrids, the consistency of the certified seed versus the natural variation in a mass-selected population. He said, "Carl, you're leaving $100,000 on the table over the last 20 years. Carl had listened. The kitchen was quiet. The coffee was on. Outside, the January wind was moving across the fields in long gray sheets. He said, "Dale, if Pioneer stops making that variety, what do you do?" Dale said, "You buy a different variety." Carl said, "And if you want the old one back?" Dale said, "You can't get it back. They're not making it." Carl nodded. He said, "That's right." That was the whole argument, as far as Carl was concerned. He never raised his voice. He never got angry. He just looked at Dale in the quiet way of someone who has already decided something so long ago that there is no longer any emotion attached to it. The decision is just there, like the ground. You don't argue with the ground. Dale went home and planted Pioneer the next spring. Carl went to the root cellar and pulled the jar labeled 1998 Eastfield, good ear emergence, and took it to the kitchen to count germination. What most people did not understand about Carl Dawson's seed-keeping operation was the scale of the attention it required. Saving seed sounds like a passive act. You harvest the corn, you save some of it, you plant it next year. This misses everything that matters. Every October, Carl spent between 8 and 12 days walking his corn. He was looking at individual plants. He would walk a row, examining each plant stalk diameter, root crown exposure, ear placement, husk condition, and mark the ones he wanted with a twist of orange flagging tape around the shank. He typically marked 200 to 240 plants out of roughly 4,000 in the field. That 10% selection rate was deliberate. Too loose and you make no progress. Too tight and you reduce the genetic diversity in the population until you have something brittle, something that performs brilliantly in one narrow set of conditions and collapses when conditions change. The marked plants were harvested by hand before the mechanical picker went through the field. Carl would pull each ear himself, husk it in the field, examine the cob for kernel set and tip fill, and either set it in a 5-gallon bucket to take in or leave it on the ground. Of the 240 marked plants, he typically kept 180 to 200 ears. The others looked right at first, but didn't hold up on closer inspection. He did not compromise on this. He had once, in 1981, kept an ear he was not sure about, because the plant had performed well in a drought-stress situation, and he wanted the genetics. The ear had poor tip fill and loose husk coverage. He planted that selection in 1982 and regretted it. He never kept a doubtful ear again. The selected ears came into the house. Clara had done this in the kitchen and on the back porch. Carl did it in the machine shed, where he had built a low wooden drying rack against the south wall in 1971. The ears hung on the rack for 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the fall weather, drying to 13 to 14% moisture, the same target as commercial corn going to the elevator, but achieved slowly, by air, rather than quickly, by propane. Slow drying preserved germination. Carl had learned this from his mother, confirmed it in a 1966 Iowa State Extension Bulletin, and kept confirming it every spring when he ran germination tests in damp paper towels on the kitchen counter. Shelling day came in December, usually in the week before Christmas, when the ears had dried down to 12% or below. Carl, shelled by hand 180 ears, takes approximately 9 hours of hand shelling, a calculation he had made precisely in 1973 and never had reason to revise. He shelled into a galvanized tub, then sorted by hand, removing the tip kernels and the butt kernels from each cob, the small irregular seeds at each end, because those seeds produce less vigorous plants. The sorted seed went into clean mason jars, labeled in pencil, sealed with a new lid, and carried to the root cellar by Carl himself, 1 jar at a time. By 2000, the root cellar held 48 jars of current seed, plus a full archive every year, back to 1965, stored in the back section. Carl had kept the archive on the theory that he might someday need to go back and recover a trait that had been selected out of the current population. He never had, but the archive was there. 48 jars of current stock, and behind them, 35 years of history, 1,965, 1,966, 1,967. All the way forward, 417 jars in total, organized by year on pine shelves that Carl had built himself in 1969. This is what the co-op did not see. This is what Vernon Stout's notebooks did not capture. This is what Dale Prochaska's financial analysis did not account for. 9 days in October, 9 hours in December, a germination test in January, and 40 years of paying attention. Carl charged himself nothing for this time. He had been doing it since he was 17. It was not labor. It was farming. In the spring of each year, Carl planted 60% of his total corn acreage with the previous fall's selected seed, and kept the remaining 40% as a seed increase block. The increase block was managed for maximum ear health, slightly lower population density, fungicide seed treatment, careful attention to detasseling if he was making a crossing, and its harvest went directly to the jars rather than the elevator. This meant Carl's corn operation was effectively split, a production field and a seed nursery, every year, whether the corn market was good or bad, whether the spring was wet or dry, whether he was feeling well or poorly. The nursery came first. The nursery always came first. His neighbors knew about it in the way that neighbors know about everything incompletely, at a distance, through the shorthand of co-op conversation. Harlan Cruz said Carl Dawson was running a museum. Earl Moody said there was something to be said for keeping the old ways, and then paused, and said, but not at the expense of your margin. Dennis Harrington said, in the autumn of 2004, that he'd driven past Carl's field, and the corn looked fine. He'd give him that. The corn looked fine, as though he expected it not to. Remember, Dennis Harrington said the corn looked fine. Remember the year, 2004. He would say something different in 2012. He would say it quietly, in the machine shed, not at the co-op, and he would not look Carl in the eye when he said it. Carl turned 70 in 2006. His wife Helen had died in 2001 of a stroke. In March, just before planting, Carl had taken 4 days. Then he had planted his corn. There was nothing heroic in this. It was simply what there was to do, and Helen would have said so herself. She had kept her own notebooks, household accounts, garden records, canning tallies, going back to 1000, 961, and Carl had moved them to the shelf above the seed archive in the root cellar after she died. Not because they belonged there exactly, but because the root cellar was the place where things were kept that mattered. Ruth and Dale helped him more after Helen's death. Dale had stopped arguing about the seed years before. He drove the planter some springs when Carl's back was bad. Ruth brought food on Sundays and checked the root cellar temperature in winter, which required nothing more than reading a thermometer and writing the number in a log, but which Carl had asked her to do because at his age it seemed unwise not to have a backup system. Ruth did it faithfully. She never missed a week. The seed kept. The population stayed vigorous. Carl kept selecting. The summer of 2012 arrived in Iowa with a particular kind of cruelty. The spring had been warm and early, the kind of spring that tricks you into optimism. Farmers planted early, the corn came up fast, and by late May the fields of Poweshiek County looked exceptional, dense, even stands, dark green in the strong light, already knee-high in the first week of June. The USDA was forecasting a record crop. Then the rain stopped. June was dry. July was catastrophic. The temperature at the Montezuma weather station reached 105 degrees on July 11th and stayed above 95 for 22 consecutive days. The soil moisture deficit across central Iowa hit levels not recorded since 1988. The corn across Poweshiek County entered its pollination period, the critical 2-week window when the silk must be moist and receptive to receive pollen from the tassel in the worst heat and drought conditions in a quarter century. Pollination is the moment when everything either works or doesn't. If the silk dries out or fires before the pollen sheds, the kernels don't set. You can have a beautiful plant, a perfect stand, a well-fertilized field, and if the silk is not right during those 2 weeks in July, you will harvest a field of empty cobs. Across Poweshiek County, that is what happened. Harlan Cruz's Pioneer Hybrid, a high-performance variety designed for maximum yield under optimal conditions, silked unevenly across his ground. The plants that silked first, in the first 3 days of the window, pollinated adequately before the heat set in. The rest did not. By the end of July, Harlan walked his field and estimated 30 to 40% of his plants were producing ears with fewer than 100 kernels against the 600-plus kernels a healthy ear should carry. He had a good crop insurance policy. He filed a claim in August. Dennis Harrington lost 60% of his corn acres to drought-induced pollination failure. Earl Moody's field, on the sandier ground along the creek bottom, was a near-total loss on the west half. The Cenex elevator in Deep River was quiet in August because there was not much coming in. Carl Dawson's corn did not fail. It did not win, either. He was honest about this. His yield in 2012 was 74 bushels per acre, well below his normal average of 130 to 135, and below what a good hybrid would have yielded in a normal year. But 74 bushels is not a failed crop. 74 bushels is a crop you can sell, a crop you can budget around, a crop that does not require an insurance claim. The reason was not mysterious. Carl had been selecting for drought tolerance in his corn population since the dry year of 1976, when he had flagged the plants that maintained silk emergence in the hot, dry 2 weeks of July and come back for their ears in October. He had done this in 1983. In 1988, in 1995, in 2000, in 2005. Every dry year, every year when the July heat pushed the weaker plants toward silk failure, Carl had marked the ones that held on and saved their seed. 36 years of selecting for exactly the conditions that 2012 delivered. His corn was not magic, it was memory. 36 Julys of memory, stored in genetics, in mason jars, on pine shelves in a root cellar under a farmhouse in Poweshiek County, Iowa. The calls came in August. The first was from Ruth, who had heard from a woman at the church in Deep River that Harlan Cruz had asked about Carl's seed. Ruth mentioned it on Sunday when she brought food. Carl said, "Tell him to come by." Harlan came on a Tuesday. He drove a new Chevy pickup and wore a clean shirt and looked like a man who had spent a week deciding to do something and still wasn't sure it was the right decision. He sat at Carl's kitchen table and drank coffee and talked around the subject for about 10 minutes before he said what he had come to say. He said he understood Carl had had a better year than most on account of his seed. He said he wasn't asking for charity. He said he'd like to buy seed for next spring, if Carl had extra. And he'd like to understand what Carl knew about selecting for drought tolerance. Carl was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The coffee was on. Through the window you could see the harvested cornfield, brown and bare, stubble in the flat September light. He said, "I've got enough seed for myself and about 40 acres more. You can have it at cost. But if you plant it, I want you to select from it." Harlan said, "Select how?" Carl said, "I'll show you." Dennis Harrington came the following week. He did not look Carl in the eye when he asked. He looked at the table. He said he'd heard from Harlan that Carl might have seed. He said he knew he'd been skeptical over the years, and he wasn't here to relitigate that. He said, and this is the part that took him the most effort, you could see it, he said that he thought Carl had been onto something that the rest of them had missed. He said it quietly, like a man paying a debt. Carl did not make him say more. He said he had 40 acres of seed and he'd split it 3 ways, Harlan, Dennis, and himself, and they'd go from there. He did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you." He did not reference any co-op conversation from any year. He poured Dennis Harrington a cup of coffee and got out his notebook and began explaining, from the beginning, how you walk a field in October. The Extension Service called in September. A young woman named Sarah Adkins, who had taken over Vernon Stout's territory after his retirement in 2008, asked if she could visit. She brought a soil scientist from Iowa State and a plant geneticist from the USDA Plant Introduction Station in Ames. They spent a full day at the farm. They went through the root cellar. They took notes. The plant geneticist, a man named Dr. James Okafor, who had spent his career working on landrace corn varieties in West Africa before joining the USDA, stood in the root cellar for a long time looking at the archive shelves. He picked up a jar from 1971, held it up to the light, set it down carefully. He said, "Mr. Dawson, do you understand what you have here?" Carl said, "I've got 40 years of corn." Dr. Okafor said, "You have a locally adapted landrace with documented selection history going back to at least 1938. That's—" He stopped. Then he said, "That's not nothing, Mr. Dawson. That's not nothing at all." Sarah Adkins wrote a report. It described Carl's operation in technical language that Carl found accurate but somehow insufficient, the way a recipe is accurate but insufficient to describe what it feels like to cook. The report recommended the population be formally accessioned into the USDA ARS germplasm repository, and that the selection methodology be documented for educational use. Carl agreed to the accession. He kept the originals. Carl Dawson died on a Friday in November of 2015, at the age of 79, 3 weeks after the October corn walk that he had not missed in 47 years. He had done the walk slowly that fall, with Ruth on one arm and a walking stick on the other, and he had marked his selections with the same orange flagging tape he had always used. Ruth said he was in the field for 6 days instead of 9, and he didn't cover all of it, and he had let her select some of the plants from the South 40 on his instruction, but he had done it. He had not missed a year. Dale shelled the last ears in December. Ruth ran the germination tests in January, in damp paper towels on the kitchen counter, the way Carl had always done it. Germination came in at 94%. Carl would have called that acceptable. The farm passed to Ruth and Dale. They have farmed it for 10 years now. They plant Carl's corn on 60% of the ground, still the same open-pollinated population that Clara Dawson began selecting in 1938, that Carl continued for 47 years, that Ruth is now in her 9th year of selecting herself. The yield has averaged 128 bushels per acre over the past decade. In a wet year, it has touched 147. In a dry year, 2020 was dry, and 2023 was dry. It has not gone below 83. The root cellar still holds the archive. 1,965 through 2014. 50 years of jars on pine shelves. Ruth has added her own years 2015, 2016, all the way to the present, and the new jars sit on a new shelf that Dale built at the far end, in the same pine, with the same dimensions. The labels are in Ruth's handwriting now, but the format is exactly the same. Year, field location, one line of selection notes. 2021 North Field, drought stress emergence. 2023 East 40, standability, dry August. Harlan Cruzy planted Carl's seed for 4 years before his son took over the operation and shifted to a certified hybrid program. Before he did, he selected from the population every October, the way Carl had shown him. He said it was the most he had ever learned about corn in a single season. He said it changed how he looked at a cornfield, not as a unit of production, but as a collection of individual plants, each one a slightly different answer to the same question. Dennis Harrington planted the seed for 2 years and then went back to hybrids. But he called Ruth in 2018 and asked if he could buy some seed for a small plot trial he wanted to run on his sandy creek bottom ground, where the certified hybrids had always performed poorly in dry years. Ruth sold him 20 pounds. She hasn't heard back about the results. She figures she will eventually. Dr. James Okafor from the USDA wrote a paper in 2017 about the Dawson corn population that was published in the journal Crop Science. It traced the documented selection history from Clara Dawson's notebooks, which Ruth had found in the root cellar, behind the archive jars, in a tin box that also held Helen Dawson's household records back to 1938. The paper described the population's demonstrated drought tolerance performance in 2012, compared it against regional hybrid yield data for the same year, and concluded that the yield differential under severe drought stress, 74 bushels per acre, versus regional averages of 31 to 44, represented a resilience characteristic worth serious attention in an era of increasing climate variability. The paper was cited 23 times in the first 2 years after publication. Vernon Stout, retired in Montezuma, was 80 years old in 2017. His daughter brought him a printed copy of the paper. She read him the abstract. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "He was a stubborn man, Carl Dawson." There was a pause. Then he said, "But he was right about the seed." Vernon Stout said this quietly, in his daughter's living room, not at the extension office and not in a yellow notebook, just said it. The way you say something you've been carrying for a while and finally decide to set down. Ruth Prochaska walks her corn every October. She is 57 years old. She knows every row of the East Field and the North 40 and the Creek Bottom plot and the South acreage, the way you know a place you have been studying your whole life without calling it study. She carries orange flagging tape in her jacket pocket. She moves slowly. She looks at each plant the way her grandfather taught her to look at the stalk, the roots, the ear, the silk, and she marks what she wants with the tape and moves on. The work is quiet. The field is quiet. In October in Iowa, the sky is very large and very pale, and the corn stubble rattles a little in the wind, and there is a smell of cold and dark earth, and something faintly sweet that is the last of the season giving way. She thinks about Carl sometimes when she walks. She thinks about Clara, who started this, in 1938, selecting ears off a field that had been farmed through the worst drought in American history and was still standing and still producing and still worth saving. She thinks about the root cellar and the jars and the archive that runs from 1965 to the present in its careful penciled sequence. She does not think of what she is doing as heroic. She does not think of Carl as a prophet. She thinks of it as what farming is, when you do it right, paying attention to what the ground tells you and keeping what it teaches. There are 48 jars of current seed in the root cellar. There are 461 jars in the archive. The population is 87 years old. If you start counting from when Clara Dawson first selected from it in 1938, or 76 years old, if you start from when Carl took over the selection at 17. Either way, it is older than the farmhouse and older than most of the equipment in the shed and older than anyone still alive who remembers the farm before Carl. The corn does not know any of this. It does not know about Vernon Stout's notebook or the Pioneer yield trials, or the Supreme Court ruling or the USDA accession or Dr. Okafor's paper in crop science. It just grows, the way it has always grown, in the black soil of Poweshiek County, shaped by every dry July and wet May and cold April and early frost that has come through since 1938, carrying all of that history in its cells. You can patent a seed. You cannot patent the rain, and you cannot patent what 87 years of paying attention looks like when July turns hot and the hybrids begin to fail. The corn is still in the ground. The jars are still in the cellar. The labels are still in pencil. The farm is still there.